when you have 2.5 million people coming in and claiming asylum, it feels to me like it is a powerful demonstration that the asylum process is broken, that people who are ordinary economic migrants are making a rational decision to essentially game the system. So is the asylum system broken, and how do you fix it?
So the composition of the people whom we are encountering is a complex one. We see people who indeed are fleeing persecution by reason of their membership in a particular social group. That is the technical definition. We see people fleeing extraordinary violence, poverty, corruption, climate change, of various reasons. Economic migration does not qualify for asylum, but our system, Fareed, is indeed fundamentally broken. And, you know, there is unanimity about that fact, but regrettably, we cannot seem to all agree upon a solution.
Let me put it bluntly. Do you think that Republicans in Congress want to solve this problem, or want to keep it alive because it works very well as election politics for them?
Certainly, I've heard that opinion expressed by others. Let me, but I want to, you know, when we speak of gaming the system, I just want everyone to understand the profile of the individuals whom we are encountering. And the President spoke of the dignity of every individual. You know, we, in the Department of Homeland Security, I issued a memo very early on that we would not use the term illegal alien. When speaking of these individuals, we use the term non-citizen. And that speaks to the importance of respecting the dignity of the individual. An individual who's a parent whose daughter cannot walk safely to school, and who is so desperate for a better life for that daughter, who allows that daughter to flee on her own in the hands of others, to traverse another country only to reach the dangers of the southern border, that speaks to the level of desperation. That daughter may not be fleeing persecution by reason of her membership in a particular social group, but at the same time, she's not gaming the system.
Well, when I say gaming the system, look, I don't blame those people. They're making the rational decision, which is it's a much better idea to apply for asylum. It takes years to adjudicate. You slip through the cracks. You can live in the country. Thankfully, we do not live in a police state. Once you get into America, it's very hard to track you down. So I'm not suggesting that these people are, they're doing the right thing. But my point is, in the old days, the Irish fled the potato famine. The Sicilians were fleeing gang violence. But that's not what, asylum was meant to be for the kind of small number of people who were individuals. What's the way to get back to that? Because otherwise, no matter what you do, you're going to be talking about a number of people applying that is beyond the capacity of any government to process. And, as you know, it's not just America that's facing this. The Brits are facing this, the French are facing this, the Spanish are facing it. And by the way, it's fueling right-wing populism.
Yes, and we've seen that in the upheaval in certain political establishments around the world. The system has to be broken. Before our administration began, the average length of time between an arrival at the border, a claim of credible fear, that initial threshold, and the ultimate adjudication of the asylum case was 6 years. 6+ years. And so,
what is it now?
And what happens? Well, what happens is people get a job. Their children go to our schools. They may have a child, a U.S. citizen child, and they establish roots. And then it becomes very difficult to remove them. Right now, what we have done is we have promulgated a regulation that seeks to collapse that 6-year period into under a year. And we've empowered our asylum officers to adjudicate those claims. And so we're making the reforms that we can.
Meanwhile, on the other end of this, which is skilled immigration, it seems to me we have a different kind of crisis. There's a huge demand for skilled labor. We don't seem able to set up an immigration system that finds these people. To me, the most remarkable statistic here is Canada let in 250,000 skilled immigrants last year. The United States, with 8 times the population of Canada, let in 85,000. The way you get in as a skilled immigrant today in the United States is you enter your name in a lottery. To me, there's nothing more symbolic of how broken the system is, that in order to get into the United States as a skilled immigrant, you don't go through a meritocratic process, you don't go through a system of rules and laws and judicious judgments about you. No, you go to Vegas. You hope that you get lucky and you hit the hard 8. Surely we've got to fix this.
So for the skilled workers, there are applications. People submit their qualifications. Companies seek to hire them. It has a level of organization.
And then you put it into a lottery.
And then you put it into a lottery. There is no question, Fareed, that our immigration system is not calibrated to our economic needs. That numeric limit on skilled workers has been in existence for years and years, and Canada is able to calibrate the number of skilled workers it seeks to join according to the market needs in the country each year, and we are just so outdated.
And again, this would require congressional action, and you just think there's no prospect of that?
I am a relentless optimist. My optimism is under grave challenge.
And again, you must be involved in these discussions. Is it possible to engage Republicans on this? Because on this particular issue, I assume that there is, again, as you say, maybe not unanimity, but a sense that these are small numbers in the grand scheme of things. They would make a huge impact on the U.S. economy. Is there any prospect of a Mitch McConnell or a Kevin McCarthy taking this on?
I can't speak to those individuals, but I can say that there are members on both sides of the aisle that have been driving for immigration reform and continue to drive for it. It's just a very, very challenging landscape, as I think we all know.
And so going forward, is your hope with the people coming in from the southern border, because I think you agree, this is not going to stop anytime soon. You've got climate change, you've got political instability, you have the usual mix of poverty and disease. People are going to keep coming. Is the idea that you will simply try to have the process work better? Do you have enough immigration judges to review this stuff so that the asylum application doesn't take 6 years? What's the long-term, short of some kind of grand immigration reform, what do you hope this looks like in a few years?
Our hope is that our model of incentivizing people to apply for relief before they take the journey and delivering a consequence regime if they don't avail themselves of those pathways works and keeps a cap, if you will, on the number of people we encounter under very dangerous circumstances. Fundamentally, we need the system to be fixed. We have an immigration court backlog with the immigration judges of over 2 million cases.
Wow. All right. As if that isn't enough, you've got a few other things on your plate. We spend a lot of time at fora like this talking about terrorism. We don't talk about it that much. Has the threat diminished?
I would say that the threat has evolved. Our department was formed in 2003. We have one of the heroes of our department, Jane Harmon, here. Of course, it was born of the tragedy of 9/11, and our focus was on the foreign terrorists seeking to enter the United States to do us grave harm. Over the years, 10 years later or so, 2012, 13, 14, it really changed. Our focus, the prior threat of the foreign terrorists persisted, but we saw a rise in prominence what we called the homegrown violent extremists. The individual already resident in the United States, radicalized to violence by a foreign ideology, who sought to do us grave harm. We have now seen that, and that remains. We just saw the arrest of a 17-year-old radicalized to violence by ISIS. So those threats persist, and we keep our focus on them, but we've seen a rise in what we term domestic violent extremism. Individuals driven to violence by an ideology of hate. We've seen hate grow exponentially in this country. Anti-government sentiment, false narratives, personal grievances, and other phenomena really disseminated and propagated on social media and other platforms.
The numbers suggest that so-called white nationalist terrorism at this point vastly outnumbers Islamic terrorism or foreign-inspired terrorism. Would you agree with that?
When you ask that, Fareed, you're speaking of domestically.
Domestic.
Domestically, we see the rise of white nationalism pose a very prominent threat. I must say it's very important because we get involved not with respect to a response to an ideology, however odious it might be, but when there's a connectivity to violence. That's where our footprint is made.
In other words, if somebody is reading white supremacist literature online, that is not sufficient cause.
That is not where we engage. Where we engage is when there's an intent to commit a violent act. We, of course, work with communities to prevent that violent act from materializing. That is what we do.
And in your view, is this white supremacist ideology and the militancy and the violence, has it peaked, plateaued, or still on the rise?
I don't think we have the confidence to say that it has plateaued. And I think, Fareed, there's a very important point to be made, because while we speak of it in the domestic context, it is an international phenomenon. And that's to say that not only is this a rise that we have observed in other nations, but we see a great deal of connectivity between individuals and small groups, loosely affiliated groups of individuals, connecting with one another internationally. And it reflects what I more broadly describe as a real convergence of Homeland Security and national security, not just with respect to domestic violent extremism, the radicalization of people to violence, but also with respect to cybersecurity and so many other aspects of our work.
Let's talk about cybersecurity. Do you feel in that realm what we are witnessing is a kind of ever-increasing tide of cyber attacks at critical infrastructure and other things, or is it manageable? How would you describe the state of the cyber threat to the United States?
I would describe it as an acute challenge, and it is varied in type. We, of course, have adverse nation states, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that are targeting our critical infrastructure. We also have criminal actors, very sophisticated criminal actors, that are using the cyber tool as a means of gaining profit.
Do you have any indication that the Russians are intending to interfere in the political process in our elections?
We are vigilantly focused on foreign interference in our elections, and the tool that is most often employed is not necessarily the manipulation of the voting booth, because we, with working very closely with secretaries of state around the country, have built redundancies and the like, so that infrastructure is secure, not impervious to attack, but where the tool of disinformation to influence individuals' intentions is a threat stream that we're very, very focused on.
There were arrests made in Florida of Russian agents who seemed to be trying to interfere in domestic Florida elections. Is that a pattern you see? It struck me as kind of slightly bizarre.
I don't know that it's a pattern, but remember, it's not just necessarily national elections that are within the purview of our work to make sure that our election system as a country is secure.
Before I open it up to questions, I thought, I'd like to have you reflect a little bit on your personal story and how it informs your work. You were 1 year old when your family fled Castro's Cuba.
Yes.
What was it like when you got here?
I've never been that precocious. So I will, let me share a story with you, because my father lost the country of his birth, lost his small business that he was very excited about, and was not able to be by his mother's side when she passed from cancer. It was the second time in my mother's life that she was a refugee. She fled World War II very late and lost a tremendous amount of family. And it really brings us back to where we started. The understanding of displacement was something that I grew up with, and it was a very profound theme in my parents' teachings to my sister and to me. When I was the director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, I visited a refugee camp in Dadaab on the Kenyan-Somali border. And I could not describe these individuals as poor, because poor sometimes can reflect that one has something but not enough. And these people had nothing. They slept on the sand. They had paper or plastic bags as the roof. When the sun set, it was pitch dark. The camp was designed for 90,000 people, and when I visited, 300,000 people were there. And I sat in on an interview of a family of 6. And the refugee officer started her questioning of the family to see whether that family could qualify to come to the United States as refugees. And she asked the 17-year-old daughter the first question of, where were you born? And the daughter looked down, puzzled, and looked up and said, well, I was born here. I was born here. She had known nothing else but that camp. And I came back, and I had a very difficult time identifying myself as a refugee, despite my upbringing and the inculcation of that definition in my being. And I reflect on that because when we promulgate policies in whatever area of our work, and our mission set is so expansive, the Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Linda Fagan, the first woman Commandant of the Coast Guard, is here. That is one of 8 operational agencies in a department that is 260,000 people strong. From FEMA to Coast Guard to Border Patrol to Secret Service, we cover so much. Whatever policy we promulgate is a reflection of not only who we are, but who we want to be. And that is a struggle in a very, very difficult climate, and that's what makes it a privilege to serve.
Okay, opening it up to questions. Jane Harmon, you created this department. Do you like the way he's running it?
You bet I do. And I just want to say to you, Ali Mayorkas, that under the most difficult circumstances and the political dysfunction of Washington, you're doing a wonderful job.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you. Thank you.
An observation and a question. The observation is that the failure of our immigration system is not the fault of the Secretary of Homeland Security. It's the fault of the United States Congress, which has missed every opportunity to reform the system. There was a pretty decent bill on the floor of the House during the Bush 43 administration, which I proudly voted for and which failed by about 5 votes. and it would have made this job manageable. I just wanted to ask about a couple of areas you didn't touch on because I think they matter enormously. One is the importation of fentanyl and fentanyl products, not just through the southern border, but everywhere else. I think everyone would be interested to hear what you're doing about that. And the other is, let's remember 9/11 was an attack on us through our air system, and TSA is part of the Homeland Security Department. And what is the Transportation Security Agency doing, especially since most of us went through airport hell to get here? I'm not blaming it on you, but it really is hard to travel these days.
Well, let me start on the second question. Airline security. I will say, when all of you think about your experience at the airport, my bet is that you think about the convenience, the facility of the travel. You don't necessarily, uppermost in your mind is not necessarily the security of your flight. And that is a transformation. And it is TSA, Customs and Border Protection, their extraordinary architecture that they have built in collaboration with the airlines, our phenomenal partners in advancing our security, and our partnership with other countries. And so it is a very sophisticated architecture that we have achieved. Jane, in your first question on fentanyl. You know, I grew up in the federal system as a federal prosecutor. I prosecuted cocaine trafficking cases, methamphetamine, black tar heroin. Nothing is like fentanyl in terms of its toxicity. Some have used the border as a cudgel and conflated migration and the trafficking of fentanyl, because over 90% of the fentanyl comes in through ports of entry. By the way, I visited the International Mail Facility at JFK Airport last week, and the number of small packages that we interdict with firearms, synthetic drugs, it is stunning. And we have advanced so far. The fentanyl problem we have 70,000 Americans die last year. It is not a creation of the past 24 months. There were, I think it was 58,000 deaths in 2020. The scourge of drugs is something that we have never overcome. We are addressing the supply side from an enforcement perspective. We are harnessing artificial intelligence to advance our capacity to interdict drugs, to be able to see anomalies in passenger vehicles, commercial trucks. I will say the creativity of the smugglers is extraordinary, and yet our ingenuity in building response protocols is also extraordinary.
Can I just ask a quick supplementary? There are two schools of thought. One, that China bears some responsibility for this because the source chemicals come from there. The other is that this is sort of China bashing, that those chemicals could have been combined into very different products. What do you think is the right way to think about it?
China, the precursor chemicals, many of which have legal use, the precursor chemicals, the pill presses that are used to manufacture fentanyl, it's extremely easy to manufacture, it's extremely quick, it's easy to conceal. We seized long vertical candles that were hollowed out with pills. China bears responsibility. We need their assistance in interdicting the chemicals and pill presses that are going in volumes that don't reflect legitimate use.
I think there was another question here. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Good morning. Firstly, I echo the Honorable Harmon's comments, so thank you for your service, Secretary Mayorkas. It's not easy to solve these complex issues, and being a public servant is not easy, so thank you. Last spring, in April 2022, DHS released its first ever equity action plan based on Executive Order 13985. Since its release, I would appreciate hearing your favorite highlights since its implementation as it relates to equitable programming across DHS. Which program has had the most progress in addressing systemic fairness under your supervision? Thank you.
Thank you. So the issue of equity is an organizational priority for our department, and I'll share what I consider to be a highlight. And it is a highlight born of a scathing article in a newspaper. The article was very critical of us, and by the way, correctly so. What my mantra inside the organization is do not shrink from criticism, just work very hard not to deserve it. But this was a criticism of us. There was a very poor black community that had been impacted by an extreme weather event. And the individuals could not access our assistance at FEMA because they could not present adequate documentation of the ownership of their homes. They did not have the deeds of trust. They did not have mortgage documents and the like. The reality was that our practices led to their disenfranchisement. These were very, very poor people. Their homes were modest at best. And the history of that community was that these homes were passed from generation to generation. And so what we did in response to that article to achieve equity was we changed our policies and practices. We said, if you do not have mortgage documents, if you do not have deeds of trust, then perhaps you have utility bills. And you can accompany the utility bills with an attestation of ownership. And we were able to enfranchise a community that previously we had disenfranchised. That's an example of achieving equity when a matter is brought to our attention.
Sir, there.
Thank you very much, Fareed. Stephen Shapiro with BENS and the Atlantic Council, and I want to just remind you, Mr. Secretary, I had the pleasure of working with you on some domestic security matters some years ago, and you are a personal, if not national hero, and I want to thank you for that. Just a question for you with respect to the recent federal decision limiting the government's opportunity to interact with social media companies in an effort to stem the tide of misinformation. It seems like a major obstacle to this effort and in an already complicated world. So your take on that.
So I thank you for the very kind words, and it's wonderful to see you again. And I am so sorry that I can't comment on that case because it is actually the subject of active litigation. Let me say this. We conduct ourselves with integrity. Homeland Security it's often described as a bipartisan issue. I actually consider it a non-partisan issue. It is an apolitical matter when we're speaking of the safety and security of the American people. And I'm sorry I can't comment further. I will say this. Disinformation is a real threat stream.
All right, somebody at the back here. I just want to be sure I'm being equitable. Ma'am, can you just wait for the mic?
Thank you. Hello again, Mr. Secretary. So if you could give one or two career advice for the Aspen Rising Leaders Program fellows, what would that be?
The most important business card that you hold is the work that leaves your desk. That's it.
Well, but given that extraordinarily succinct and intelligent advice, you've also hit the time limit perfectly. Mr. Secretary, pleasure to have you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.